Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Mem Hey in Zbachim, as we learn for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael and Sun Basar V'Shivya. Says the Mishnah, the top of the page, near the top of the page. Kodesh of the Gechavim. Goyim are allowed to give bring karbanos. They're allowed to send in their karbanos. Obviously, they can't officiate in the Beis Hamikdash, but they can send if they want to bring a carbon to the Beis Hamikdash to our God. They can. But the question is, do they have all the same rules? So Reb Shimon says they do not. There's no isser of pigel, meaning if the Kohen was mafagel their carbon, and then somebody ate it, it's not chayv kares. Same thing, nosar, the isser of kares, if you ate something, an animal that was left over past its time period, also it doesn't apply there. And tameh here means that if you're tameh and you eat a carbon, you're not supposed to eat a carbon. If you're tameh, you're chayv kares. But here it means no. But according to Reb Shimon, this is the first opinion listed here in the Mishnah, that if you're tameh and you eat a carbon of a goy, you're not chayiv on that. Not only it applies both ways. Tameh could be if you're tameh, you're not supposed to eat a carbon, or if the carbon is tameh, you're not supposed to eat it. So the Mefarshim here say that what that b'chlal ze isra achilas kachim b'tumah hey b'tumah saguf she'eina tameh musar b'achilas kachim. Even if you're tameh, you're not allowed to eat kachim, but you're not commanded not to eat the kachim of a goy. Apparently, the kachim of a goy have a lesser status. Hey b'tumah's basar, or if the meat is tameh and you're not, which is also usher, it's not the chayiv kares, but you're also shikala mitumas aguf, v'nomeres mikav v'chomer. Aval ein bechlal zeh avoda betuma b'kotshek. It doesn't mean you're allowed to do the work. In other words, if a kohen is tameh, it doesn't mean that he's allowed to do the avoda of a goy's carbon. It doesn't mean that. It just means that if he's tameh, he's not chayiv for eating it, or he's not chayiv for eating if the animal is tameh. So that's what Reb Shimon says. It's also shchitas chutz. You're also potter, Reb Shimon. Shimon says in all these cases, even though he says potter, he says ein chayavon alein. It's mashma. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't eat an animal, even if the animal was a carbon of a goy. If it became pigel noser or tameh, you shouldn't eat it. But you're not chayev. Or shochem b'chutz also you're potter. Potter always uses potter avalos to Reb Shimon. But Rabbi Yossi says you're chayev. Rabbi Yossi says there's no difference between an animal of a goy or an animal of a Jew. There are differences in the way they could be makar. We'll see different halachas, but basically it's a carbon. If it's carbon, it's hegdish, and the rules of pigel and also Talmud would apply to it as well. Or if shechted outside, the base should also be chayiv. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. The halacha is like Rabbi Yossi that you are chayiv for pigel noser and tameh or shchitas chutz of an animal of a carbon brought by a guy. Tan rabbanim. Now, as usual, the Bryce expands on the Mishnah. Koshev Gechavim, Goyim, who gave their karbanos, what's the rules about them? Lo nehen v'lo ma'on. So whenever we find this lashon of lo nehen v'lo ma'on, lo means that you're not chayiv for sacrilege, for misusing an animal. And when it says lo nehen, you're not supposed to have hana. The whole idea of lo ma'olin is that me'ila means you're not supposed to have hana from something that's kachim. So when he says lo ma'olin, there's no isser over there ma'on, but that means it's no isser d'oraisa of me'ila, but lo nehen and midrabanan, you shouldn't have hana. Whenever the Gemara says lo nehen and v'lo ma'on, that's what it means. There's no me'ila in Torah for you're chai for misuse, but there's also midrabanan, you're not allowed to have hana from it. Okay. So here the Brisa right away expands because the Mishnah didn't talk about me'ila, but the Brisa, we'll see this opinion. This is Reb Shimon in the Brisa. Some have a girsa that it's Rav Meir, but in any case, we pass on Reb Yossi. But he says over here, that's like Reb Shimon in our Mishnah. Another thing he says that it can't make a tmura. Normally, we hold that if you have an animal of kachim, let's say call that A, and you want to say B should be kadosh in place of A, they both become kachim. Certain ones can be brought as karbanos, and certain ones you have to let them die. You don't bring them as a carbon, but can even make a tmura. So he says so according to Reb Shimon, the kachim of a goy can't even make a tmur out of it. If you say B should be like A, it has no effect. Then the nesachim. Goyim cannot bring a libation, a wine, a drink offering. Sometimes it could be oil, it could be wine, it could be water. We have in sukkahs. So they don't have such. Now there's nesachim that are brought by themselves. You could just say, "I'd like to give a mizbeach. I can't afford an animal, but I'd like to give some wine to the mizbeach." I'd like to give that to the base of Mikdash. Jews could do that, but goyim have no such thing as nesachim, meaning the karbanos that they bring, that they offer, that they send in, those do require nesachim, as we'll see, but they can't bring nesachim as a carbon by itself. Explains Rashi, b'fnei atzman, below zevach Yisrael shemisnad min yayin kidet namach. He could bring a wine offering. A Jew could bring a wine offering by itself, without a carbon. Goyim can't do that. Aval karbana and talim nesachim did Reb Shimon. Even though Reb Shimon is makel when it comes to all these rules of goyish karbanos are different than Jews, but their carbon does require nesachim. In other words, we'll see if either they send it in or we supply the nesachim that go along with their carbon. But nesachim that are brought by themselves, they can't do. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rani b'kulin lahachmer. So Rabbi Yossi, like Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah, who says you're chayiv in those cases, he says in all these cases, goyis is like a Jew. Shneimar b'hem lashem. It's learned out of a pasuk that, how do you know a goy can bring a carbon? He says ish. The extra ish is marba, even a goy. Right? So he says, therefore he says the same rules apply. Pigel, noser, tamei, shchitus, chutz, all these things apply. Now the Gemara says ben var momurim. This ben var is not going on Rabbi Yossi, it's going on Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon, who says what? That the rules, that there's no me'ilah when it comes to the first thing that he said in the Gemara. There's no me'ilah. Right? When does that apply? Kosher Mizbeach. Well, we'll see why. Because it's learned out from Truma, which is Kosher Mizbeach. Abel Kosher Bedek Abayis Malin Bon. But a Kosher Bedek Abayis, there is Me'ilah there. In other words, what's Kosher Bedek Abayis? I'm giving wood, I'm giving non-kosher animals, I'm giving stuff to the base of Mikdash to be used. That has a Kedusha, and that only a Kosher Mizbeach. Why? The Chayi might say, if Kosher Bedek Abayis is Me'ilah, certainly Kal V'chomer Kosher Mizbeach, which is a higher degree of Kedusha. You can't exchange it. Kosher Bedek Abayis, you can always exchange. You can always say, okay, I gave some wood. Okay, the wood's worth $10. I like the wood back, and in place, I'm going to give some nails. I'll give $10 worth of nails. You could do that. But when it comes to Kosher Mizbeach, you can't do that unless it has a mum. So Kosher Mizbeach have a higher degree of Kedusha. So you might think it's a Kal V'chomer. If you're chayav me'ilah of a goy's animal on Kosher Bedek Abayis, certainly on Kosher Mizbeach, the answer is based on psukim. Almost everything in this Masechta is based on psukim. Lonan v'lonan, like I explained before, lonan and midrabanan. Midrabanan, you're not supposed to have enough from these things because they do have kedusha. But there's no me'ilah. Why? Why is there no me'ilah? The gomer me'ilah chet mitruma. It says chet by me'ilah when it comes to committing sacrilege, misusing something belongs to the base of Mikdash, and it says chet by truma, of chet. And ubetruma ksiv b'nei Yisrael v'lav kechavim. And there it says only by truma. It says b'nei Yisrael and not goyim. And therefore, we learn out just like Truma only applies to Jews, the same thing Mila only applies to Jews, not to Goyim. My time. What's the reason why you're not chayav pigul nasar b'tamei? The answer is the asi pigul avon minosar. Pigul is exever shava. It says avon by pigul, it says avon by nosar. And the nosar is learned out for asi nosar chil mituma. And by nosar is a lashon of chilu lo yechalu, and tuma is lo yechalu. Uvatuma, and by Tuma Ksiv, B'nai Yisrael v'levkechav. It says, V'yinazru B'nai Yisrael, right? They should stay away, if they're Tuma, they should stay away from the karbanos. So what do we have over here? We're saying that we're learning out pigul, what's called that C, from Nosar, which is B. And Nosar, which is B, is learned out from Tuma, right? By Tuma it says B'nai Yisrael, so therefore we know that pigul and Nosar don't apply to Goyim. Just like Tuma doesn't apply to Goyim. Goyim aren't really Tamei. Right, and not Tamei D'Oraisa. So, and theirs is Bnei Yisrael, by Tumas is Bnei Yisrael, not Goyim. The same thing, Nosar and Pigul also don't apply to Goyim. Why don't you all ask, aren't you learning out C from B and B from A, which we said, the chart, which is based on the Gemara and Mem Tes, which we're going to have in a couple of days, right? A few more days, we have that chart. And the chart says what? That it comes to, when it comes to Kodshim, you can't always learn out C from B after you learn out B from A. The answer is what? Is that this is learned out. What are we talking here? A Hekesh or Gzeira Shava? We're talking about Gzeira Shava, right? Gzeira Shava, Avon. The Gzeira Shava says Avon here, it says Avon there. And I know, sir, it says Chilul, and by Tum it says Chilul. Gzeira Shava, you're allowed to. Says the Gemara. It says the chart. Like you look at the chart on Daf Mem Tes Nun, the chart that I've given out. Davalam Gzeira Shava. Can you continue learning Gzeira Shava? The answer is yes, you're allowed to. That's in the right smack in the middle of the chart. Column 3, row 3. Davalam Gzeira Shava, Ma'osham Gzeira Shava. You can. That's not a problem. Problem is when it comes to certain hekishes, right? But when it comes to Gzeir Shava, you're allowed to. So Davam Gzeir Shava, Chosam Lam Gzeir Shava. Okay, so that's why this isn't a problem. And that's why Reb Shimon says, both in the Mishnah and in the Brisa, that a goy's carbon, you're not chayiv for pigul noser and tamei in those cases. Okay, and like I said before, it doesn't mean that a kohen who's tamei can serve in the Beis Mikdash and can be osek with the shchita b'halachas rika. Just means that he's not chayiv if he's tamei for eating it or if the carbon is tamei. Okay, back in the Gemara, the ein osin tmura, the carbon of a goy, you cannot make a tmura. That is, if you have a carbon, I call that animal A, and you want to say B should take the place of A, it doesn't work. It's not effective. My time. This gish tmura lemaiser. Oh, because we have a hekesh between tmura and maser behema. Maser behema, because it's all in the same pasuk, they're all juxtaposed. Umaiser behema is gish lemaiser dagam. Maiser behema is compared to maiser dagam. Over maiser dagam sip b'nei Yisrael v'lavikachavim. And by maiser dagam it says b'nei Yisrael. Doesn't and b'nei Yisrael means not goyim. So we have a hekesh between what? Between maiser dagam and maiser behema. And between Meiser Behema and Tmura. But here we got a problem. This is a Hekesh. And what does the chart say about Hekesh, which is the Gemara, right? Davalon beHekesh. You can't learn out with Hekesh again. So you can't learn out C from B and B from A if they're all not the Hekesh. Okay. So we got a problem here, right? Says the Gemara, if when it comes to Kachim over here, something that's learned out. If you learn out B from A via Hekesh, you cannot learn out C from B via Hekesh. The answer is Meiser Dagan is Chulin. That's not Chulin. Anybody could eat Meiser Dagan, right? Meiser Behema, anybody could eat also, but it has Kachim. You have to bring it as a carbon. But Meiser Dagan doesn't have to go to the base of Mikdash. You get Meiser, right? You take Trumas and Meisers in your kitchen or whatever you do in your barn and whatever you in your silo, wherever you are in the field. It's not Kachim. So Meiser Dagan is Chulin. Oh, so then what are we saying? You want to learn out A to B and B to C, and A is Meiser Dagan, B is Meiser Behema, and then Meiser Behema is going to learn out to C, which is Tmura. Yeah, but A, the thing you start off with, Meiser Dagan, is not Kachim. There's no problem learning out Hekesh from Hekesh when it comes to non-Kachim. It says Meiser Dagan is Chulin, it's not Kachim. Okay, but the thing that's learned out, B, Meiser Behema, is Kachim. Right? So what do you look at? What's the determining factor to say, is this Kachim or not? Is it the Melamed, A, which is teaching, Meiser Dagan, which is teaching you to B? Or is it the Lomed, the thing that's been learned out? Is it B? So, Hanicha Laman Damar Basar Melamed Azlinin. If you look at the thing that the original source, the thing that the original teacher, right? The original source, in this case, Meiser Dagan, okay, that's not Kachim, so you're okay. You don't have Kachim to Kachim, Hekesh to Hekesh, and Hekesh all by Kachim. You look at the first thing, which is only Chulin. And even if you say B to C is, but B to C you can learn out. That's only one Hekesh. Elamandam or Basar Lamadazlin, if you look at the thing that's learned out, you look at B, and that's the determining factor to say that this Hekesh and Hekesh is Kachim. Michael, what are you going to say? Ella is a different reason. Nothing to do with Hekesh at all. Ella Meiser Behema Chova She'ein Kavulam Zman. Meiser Behema is a chov. In other words, if you have 10 animals born in the same year, you have to count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the 10th one is Kachim, right? But there's no specific time. You don't have to bring it on a certain day. You wouldn't bring it on Shabbos or Yantif. It's Meiser Behema is a chova She'ein Kavulam Zman. But chova She'ein Zman, Yisrael Maisu Avicham. Goyim don't bring a chov shelam zman. They don't bring a chov sheyesh lam zman. Also, Rashi points out, but they only bring nedar medava. So the pasuk it turns out that ish it says the chol nedreim. They can be menader, they can be out of something, but they have no chova. Goyim don't have a chov, an obligation to bring a certain carbon. So therefore, he says like this. The reason we know that they can't make a tmura is simply learned out from Meiser Behema. Right, there's a hekesh between the two of them. There's no two hekeshes. We're not going A to B and B to C, right? Because A to B and B to C would be a problem. Hekesh to hekesh. The answer is we're only looking at B and C. There is no A, so we only have one hekesh. We're learning out Meiser Behema from Tmura. And just like by Meiser Behema is a chova that doesn't have a zman kavua, right? And chova that only Jews are obligated to. Therefore, goyim are. And so Meiser Behema, goyim are not chayv Meiser Behema, and Tmura is mukash to Meiser Behema. So, because goyim are only can bring things which are not obligation, they're not obligatory. They can offer something. They want to give an ed or a dava, they're allowed to, but there's no obligation. That's what he means here. Doesn't mean to say that a chov sheyesh lehem zman they are chayiv, and there is no such thing by goyim as a chov sheyesh lehem zman, and there is no such thing as chov at all. It just mentions that because since Rashi just brings out elo psikale hol mavi and ola v'sham nedava, it's not a definite thing. Aval meiser. Meiser behem and chatas v'ashem lo shach. There's no such thing as there's no chatas v'ashem and meiser behem are obligations. They have no such thing as an obligation. Ein mavi and asachim. Goyim don't bring drink offerings on their own, not on their own, the goyim on, but by themselves, not without a carbon. There are drink offerings that you bring as a carbon. That mincha sam and a scam kim du bar shlosh saram lepar. All the scam that we talk about, the karbonos we repeat in the davening. Those are nesachim usually that are brought with a carbon. But can you bring a nesachim by yourself, by itself? Yes, you may, but not goyim. And so because it says there Ezrach, only a native Jew. That's how you know. I might think that his carbon, the animal, doesn't require nesachim. Talmud Lamer kacha, it says kacha in that pasuk, telling you that every carbon ola requires the carbon requires a nesachim with it. So if the guy sends in, let's say he sends in $100 for his animal, he doesn't send the nesachim, so the base meat supplies the nesachim. But if a guy donates just the drink offering, the nesachim by itself, that's not accepted. I'm Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi, like he said in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi is mechayiv when he goes to Rabbi Yossi in the Brisa. He said ro'ani b'chul lahachmer. He says that goyish karbonos basically have the same rules as Jews. It doesn't mean to say that he would agree necessarily in the case of Tamura. Maybe he would agree there that by Tamura, if it's based on a pasuk, maybe he would agree with that. It's not clear what Rabbi Yossi would say about all this, but he says bekulon. So if he says bekulon, it could very well be that he's machmer not only on pigul noser b'tamei, but also on Tamura. He doesn't hold of that hekesh, and maybe they could bring the nesachim by themselves too. Maybe he's machmer and everything. So Roni Bekun Lahachim Medvar Murim. Now the Gemara, the Brisa went on to say Medvar Mekashim Mizbeach. What's that going on? That Medvar Mekashim Mizbeach is going to be even on Reb Shimon. When do you say that there's no Me'ilah? Only Kashim Mizbeach. My time. Eksav Kigomer Me'ilah. When you learn Me'ilah Chet Mi Truma is learned out from Truma. Do me the Truma. It's got to be like Truma to Kedusha Saguf. Truma is considered Kedusha Saguf. Only goes to the Kohen. Aval Kedusha Berekabai is the Kedusha Samlo. It's sometimes based on the pasuk, not based on a svara. Turn about on the last line on the page. Turn about a dam shenitma, dam that became tummy. We always learn that the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol is maratza, even if the dam became tummy. So it's dam shenitma v'zarko b'shogeg. If you did a b'shogeg hortz, it's accepted. In other words, basically became tummy. You should start all over again, get a different carbon. But if he didn't b'shogeg, the tzitz is maratza. B'mezid on Amid Beis. If he did it on purpose, knowing full well that it was tummy, he did it anyway. It's not maratza. Does that mean you have to start all over again? Says Rashi, look at the top Rashi on the left side, the top line on the page on Amid Beis. Lo maratza knas rabbanon. It's knas rabbanon. V'lo shi'abiach. You don't bring another one. Then came nitzu bezin masan like a davar Torah, because the carbon basically is accepted because of the tzitz that the Kohen Gadol wears as maratza. It makes the dam accepted even though it was tamei. So if you say lo hurtza, you got to start all over again. Then the new carbon you're going to bring is chulun is like chulun dalzara because you were already yotzei. It just means elalo hurtza lahater baslachi. You can't eat it. Avalbam miskaprim, but the owner is mechupar. So b'mezid, well, usually when you find that in Shas also, b'shogeg it works. B'mezid it doesn't work. It's usually a knas. Not in all cases, but many cases. Medvar more biyachab. That's an individual's carbon that was tummy, that the dam came tummy. Ablet sibor. But let's say it was. We have a klal tuma hutra b'tzibur. If it was out of tzibur, beimishag meimezed hurtza, because that's the rule of tuma of tuma hutra b'tzibur. B'moed, you bring the carbon in its time, even if it was tamei. Or gechavim by a goy beimishag meimezed lo hurtza. If it became tamei, it's not maratza whether you did it b'mezed or b'shogeg. Amur ban coming up, Papa command lo kabyosi. We just said we pass on kabyosi is machmer, and he says that the rules of goyish karbanos apply also. The rules of Jewish karbanos apply to goyish karbanos. But you're saying over here that of a goy doesn't work. Command lo kabyosi. Di rabyosi Amar b'kohen ron lahachmer. He holds that goyish karbanos have the same rules as Jewish karbanos. So if you're saying that b'mezid it's no maratza by a Jew, and but b'shogeg it is, so why by a goy is not maratza at all? Amar Papa field term rabyosi. Shani Yosem Domer Krav, when it talks about that the tzitz is maratza, the pasuk says Amar Kra lahem, it'll be maratza lahem, lahem v'lo v'kachavim. It's a special rule. Yes, in general, Rabbi Yossi does say that the Goyish karbanos have the same rule as the Jewish karbanos, but here it says lahem by the tzitz is being maratza. The tzitz makes the carbon acceptable even though the dam was tamei. It's because it says lahem v'lo v'kachavim. Amalei Rafuna B'Rei Rav Naslan Rav Papa Elameata. When it talks about tumah, it says Asher Heim Makdish Yunazu B'Nei Yisrael Min HaKoshim. You should stay away from the koshim when they're state of tumah. Asher Heim Makdishim Hachanami Heim V'Lo v'kachavim. Are you going to say what? Only if the Jews are tamei, not if the goy, not if the goy, or for carbon that was tamei, or if a Kohen was tamei, he shouldn't. If a Kohen's tamei, he would be allowed to officiate even at a carbon of a tamei person, because only if the Jews are makdish, then these rules apply. You should stay away if you're tamei, and not by that of a goy, because it says asher heim elam ravash, and you don't want to say that because Rabbi Yossi says is machmer. He says Jewish karbanos and goyish karbanos have the same halacha. So if you're saying that Rabbi Yossi would be moda, that the dam is not maratza by Ve'er Goy because it says lahem, what about when it says asher heim akdishim? The rules of tumah shouldn't apply. A Kohen should be able to a Kohen who's tamei should be able to officiate at the carbon of a goy. Elam Ravashi, Omer Kol the pasuk says l'rotzon lahem. Oh, back in the pasuk when it talks about the tzitz, it just says l'rotzon lahem ba'av kachavim labanei artzonenu. Their karbanos in general not maratza. In other words, the whole idea of the tzitz is that it should be maratza. Goyim don't have a halacha of ritzui, of accept. Their karbanos accepted. They can give what they want, but it doesn't have the same ratzon. Jews have more of an obligation. And kol mitzvah osa yoter gadol mi edom mitzvah osa. But the goyim have no such. They're not mitzvah osa, and therefore they don't have ratzon. They're not b'nei ritzui at all. Kosh Baruch Hu she'enim misratza lehem. Hashem doesn't accept their karbanos in the same way that He accepts Jewish karbanos. Says the Mishnah. Now this goes back to the previous Mishnah that we learned last week. Not last week, I shouldn't say last week, it was really Monday's Mishnah. On Monday, we learned that you're only chayav pigel on things that are mutar, that are permitted through something else. The meat is mutar through the fact that the murim were brought or the dam was sprinkled. But something which is not mutar, something which is not permitted through something else, that doesn't have lach of pigel. The Mishnah said, pigel, kometz, vaktoros, valvona. These things are not permitted through something else. They themselves are matir, or they're matir themselves. So the rules of pigel don't apply. Okay, says the Mishnah now on Mem Hayim and Beis, even though those things are not chayiv and pigel. Why? Because they themselves they're not permitted via something else, but rather they themselves are things that permit. They are not permitted through something else, but they themselves permit. But you're still chayiv noser and tamei. Dvarm she'en chayiv shem pigel chayam shem noser v'tamei. Meaning, even though that would mean the komets and the levon and these things which are not permitted through something else, but if you ate them after it was noser, was left over, or if you were tamei, you're chayiv, except for dam. Chutz min dam, even though it was noser or tamei, you're not chayiv. We'll see because it's based on a pasuk. Reb Shimon mechayiv b'davar she'darkon lechol. He says, yeah, you're chayiv. I agree. You're chayiv for noser and tamei for things which you're not chayiv on pigel because they are things that permit themselves, but they're not permitted through something else. That's only if it's something which is normally eaten. Things such like wood and frankincense and the incense, the ktoras, which are not normally eaten. Ein chaim shem tumah. There's no chayiv on tumah. We'll see. Rishon will be explained in the Gemara. Tarabanim says the Gemara in Beis Yochel chayovin mishum tumah elod over sheish lamatirin. I might think that you're only chayiv tumah and one on over sheish lamatirin. Like what? Like we said by pigel. You're only chayiv on something which something else is matzah, bein lod and bein mizbeach. Like we said by pigel, right? By pigel we said that it's got to be just like pigel in the case of shlomim, right? Just like we said, why? Because just like the pasuk talks about chayiv pigel for something like the meat, if you eat the meat of something that became mutter to eat al yedei something else, or through the dam and the murim, there you're chayiv pigel. Okay, so I might think the same thing applies to tumah. You shouldn't be chayev if you ate this in a state while you were tamei, like the meat, right? Whether it was the meat which is mutter to a person to eat, or the emurim, or in the case of an ola, that it goes burnt on the murim is on the mizbeach, in case of menorah, even the meat's on the mizbeach. So maybe only those things, right? Only those things are chayiv tumah, but you shouldn't be chayiv tumah only on things which should, but not if they themselves are matter. And I'll say a kal v'chomer from pigel, v'dinu, ma pigel, manach pigel, shu b'kviyah, applies even on a stringent carbon, meaning a carbon which is kavua, not a carbon that if you're poor you can bring birds instead, if you're very poor you bring flour, but rather it's on a carbon that's kavua, that has a stringency, you must bring the four-legged animal. Uvi achas. You don't need a yediyah at the beginning, like in the case of Tumas Mikdash for Kodshev, where you knew you were tummy, you forgot, you went into the base of Mikdash, or you ate Kodshim, like Tumas Mikdash Kodshev for Diachas. No, you're chayiv even on one yediyah. You didn't know what you did, you had no knowledge before, you just did some isser, right? Did some isser and you found out about it, you're chayiv. So pigel, which is only chayiv, which is chayiv even on a carbon kavua. And you're chayiv even one yediyah. V'lo hutter mechlolo, and it's never mutter. By Tumah is hutter, but tzibur. Right? If you have a tzibur, if it's a carbon of a tzibur, it's mutter to bring it even in the state of tumah. Machlokas, whether it's we say it's nitcha or it's hutra or nitcha. But the point is that if it's tamei, there is a heter for it, whereas pigel has no such heter. Its number one applies even on a carbon kavua. It applies even when there was only one yediyah. Below hutra machlalo. So if over there by pigel, which is more stringent, we say what? That you're only chayiv still only davar sheish l'matira. You're not chayiv on the dam, or you're not chayiv on the komets, or you're not chayiv on the levona, or you're not chayiv on minchas kohanim, which is totally burnt because it's not mutar idei something else. And still we say that by pigel, even though it's more stringent, you're not chayiv. You're only chayiv on davar sheish l'matira, not on the matir. Still, lo mitchol ein chayiv el davar sheish l'matira and bein ladam mezbeach tumah. A tumah which is more, let's say less stringent. Shiba olav, right? Sometimes tumah you have like tumas mishul kachav. If you what's the carbon chatas you bring? It's a carbon olav. If you're poor, you can bring even flour. Ubashtedidus, you had to know before, you forgot, and then you went in. So it's got more leniencies. It's easier to get out of it. And if it's b'tzibur, it's mutter. And it didn't chayav el davar sheish. Certainly should only be chayav on davar sheish matir, not be chayav on komets and nechas kohanim, etc. Bein lo bein mizbeach. That's what I might think. In other words, based on kal v'chomer. If pigel, which is more stringent, still you're only chayav what pigel? Only on the meat or only on the murim, only thing which is mutar idei something else, but not the matter itself. So tumah, which is less stringent. Because you're less stringent, because you could even bring a little lesser carbon. And you only chayiv if you had two yediyas. So yediyah at the beginning, you chayiv. In other words, it's less stringent. And it's mutter, but tzibur certainly showing chayiv on davar sheish l'matir and bein lo mizbeach. Talmud omer asher heim makdishim li. When it talks here about the karbonos, right? It says asher heim makdishim li, they're makdishim me, meaning if you're tamei, these rules apply. You can't bring it. In other words, the pasuk asher heim makdishim li tells me that if you're in a state of tumah, you can't do this at all. So yachal miyad. In other words, any animal that became tamei, or if you're tamei, any animal that you're dealing with, you're chayiv any part of the animal, not just the sink which is mutar idei something else, but even the parts that are matir. I might think as soon as you're makdish an animal, even you didn't offer it yet, and you ate it, you should be chayiv for tumah. Tama lomer yakriv, only you offered it. Amar blazer. So what do you mean you offered it? You brought v'chiyesh nagev shu chayiv just because you touched it? Like what does that mean? Yakriv. If you're makriv, you're an animal that you're being makriv v'chayiv of tumah. What do you mean? Just because you touched it doesn't mean that. Obviously, you have to eat it. Elamat amar yakriv. We're talking about where the animal was prepared and was fit to be brought. Hakesa yesh lamatirin. If the animal has a matir like Shchit Kabbalah Zrika, you got to do the Zrika, you got to be Makiv Murim in order to eat it. Once it's fit to be eaten, and you ate it in a state while you're tamei, that's when you're chayiv. Ain l'matir, if it has no matirin else in itself, mishiyaktish b'kli, as soon as you put it in a kli, like the komets or the levona, as soon as you put it in a kli, at that point, if you ate it, you're chayiv for that. In other words, at that point, it's fit. So what do you see? That you're chayiv whether it's a davar sheish l'matirin or davar shein l'matirin. If it itself is a matir, you're also chayiv. The ashkan tumah. Okay, so we've said here tumah is not like pigel. The Mishnah the other day on Monday we said all the things that you're not chayiv on pigul, komis, ktoris, lavonim, minchas kohanim, minchas kol Mashiach, dam, and asachim, habam fnei atzman, where there's no other matter that's matter them, but they themselves are matter. There's no pigul, but tumah does apply based on the pasuk Hashem makdishim li. Yaakov, as soon as you offer it, as soon as it's fit for offering, whether if it's a davashation material from the time that it has a material, ain't a material, you're chayiv for eating it right then. So that's fine by tumah. No summer no one, because we started us by saying that what. I might think what the Mishnah said, Dvarm Shein Chayv Mishim Pigol, Chayv Mishim Noser, Mishim Tomei. Okay, so we just explained Tumah based on the Pasuk Shehem Makdishim. As soon as they're Makdishit, you're Chayev. Noser, and how do I Noser? Asi Chil Chil Mituma. I'm going to learn how to Xaver Shava from Tumah. We had that on Amud Aleph also. You learn how Chil Chil from Tumah. What do we have on Amud Aleph? We said, what did we say? Chil Chil from Tumah was what? Not the same thing. On Amud Aleph we had, what do we have? That was Tmura. Right? Where do we have there? Where do we have by Me'ila? The Gomer the Gomer Chet from Truma, right? And where do we have Chil Chil? Lasi Noser Chil Chil Mituma. There also we have the same Zera Shava. So we'll say that just like Tuma you're chayiv on, even if it's a dover, it's not a dover sheish matirin. It itself is a matir. You're chayiv if you ate in the state of Tuma. No stars learned out Chil Chil from Tuma. So Gemara says, "V'leilif avan oven mi pigel." Pigel, you're not chayiv on something which is ein lo matir. You're only chayiv on davar sheish lo matir. It's something else is matir. That's the Mishnah before said that. And here we say, okay, dvarim shein chayiv shem pigel, like things that are matir something else or matir themselves. You still chayiv noser and tuma. How do we know tuma? Shem mekdishim. How do we know noser? You learn out from tuma. Wait a minute. Why you learn out from tuma? That you're chayiv there. Why don't you learn an oven from pigul? And pigul, you're not chayiv on davar she'ein lo matirin. You're only chayiv on something which something else is matir. Pigul, we said the komets or the minchas kohanim, something which is not mutar ayidei something else. You're potter on. So why don't you learn out oven mi pigul? Mistavra mituma havila lemelef shekain gazel. Better learn out from tuma because tuma and noser have three things in common. The abbreviation for them is gezel. What are they? So Rashi, about 8-9 lines from the bottom of the page, Shin Gezel Simon, Noser and Tumah are psula guf. The gimel is guf. They're psul in the guf. Noser and Tumah, something's wrong with the guf. Upigel so machshava. In the case of Tumah, it's the guf of the person. In the case of Noser, it's the guf of the animal, as opposed to a psul in the machshava. In other words, something not wrong physically with it. It's a psul in the machshava. Okay, so it has that in common. So therefore, Noser has that in common with Tumah. And Noser and Tumah, there's no Zrikas Adam which doesn't be psulin. Noser and Tumah is Tumah not because of the Zrikas Dam, but by Pigul we said Pigul's Zrikas Dam Kabaso. Remember, even though you had a bad machshava, when does it really become Pigul? If you followed through and you did Shchit Kabbalachas Rika. If you didn't do this Rika, it's not Pigul. Right? And Bepsul Nosar, V'Tameh, never been Chil. It says Chilul by Noser and Tameh, and that's the Lamed. So you have the Gimel is the Guf, Zion is the Zman, not the Zman, rather Zrika. The Zrika is a Dam, right? Noser and Tumah, the Zrika's Dam doesn't bring it to it, so it doesn't make it disqualified. Whereas by Pigul, the Zrika's Dam disqualifies it, and Pigul and Pigul, the Dam, and Noser and Tameh have a thing in common that says Chilul by both of them. So you'd rather learn out from Chilul to say what? That you're chayiv if you ate it. Remember, by Pigul, you're only chayiv on davar sheyesh lo matirin. By Noser and Tumah, we're saying you're chayiv even a davar she'ein lo matirin. Okay, and therefore you learn out from Chilul. So Gemara Adarab back in the Gemara, 5 lines from the bottom page of the Gemara Adarabba. Me Pigul learn out from Pigul. Shekain Hutter is the girsa, not Nosar. It's Hutter. We'll see what that means. There's 5 things in common. Pigul it has 5 things in common with Pigul. That is Nosar has 5 things in common. Hutter, Tzitz, Tahor, Bisman, and Karev. All right, there's 5 things in common. We'll see what those 5 things are. Rashi explained them. Behind inefficient. In other words, you want to say you should learn on Noser from Tumah to say what that you're chayiv if you ate it even on davar she'ein lo matirin. You're chayiv learn out from Tumah. It has 3 things in common. Yeah, but it has 5 things in common with Pigul. And the Mefarshim explain. When you have a choice of learning Alexander Shava from something L'Kula or L'Chumra, you always go L'Chumra. So what was your Havamina? You want to say you go L'Chumra, learn it out from Tumah, and you're Chayiv on Davar, even on Davar She'ein Lo Matirin. No, better learn it out from Pigul and go that you're Potter on Davar She'ein Lo Matirin, right? You learn it from Pigul. What's the havmina? If it's Xavier Shava, you always learn out L'chomer, not L'kula. The answer is V'hane Nefishin was the key. He wanted to say not just learn it out based on the Xavier Shava, but rather learn it out based on the fact that it has 5 things in common. V'hane Nefishin, and there's more, 5 against 3. So, and what are the 5? So here, take a look at Rashi, 5 lines from the bottom of the page in Rashi. Okay, what are the 5 them? Shekain Hutter, Tzitz, Tor, Bisman, Korb, Hani, and Fish. What are they? Nosar, 4 lines from the bottom of the page in Rashi. Nosar and Pigel have what in common? Lo Hutra Mechlolim. They never there's no heter for the tzibur or anything like that, as opposed to Tuma Ketuma. And number 2, Beina Tzitz Maratza Layo, Ketuma. Now even the Afagav the Betuma Saguf Kamina, Shan Tzitz Maratza. Tzitz not Maratza if you're Tummy, Tzitz is Maratza if the dam or the carbon became Tummy. But same Tuma Mia near Tzitz is Matir, some Tuma, as opposed to Tzitz doesn't help at all for Nosar and Pigel. So therefore Nosar should have another thing in common with Pigel. Tor, Shnei, and Torin. Both in the case of what? Shnei and Torin, Shnei and Some's mom. They're both Tor. Tumah is Tomei, right? Whereas Nosar and Pigel are Tor. They just have a different Isser. Shnei and Som Bisman, right? They're both Puzzles Man. One is Mamish literally by left over the next day, right? Bisman. Zeb ben Nosar, Chutz Lizman. Right? In other words, Shnei and Som Bisman, Zeb ben Nosar, right? Bisman Zeb ben Nosar, and Chutz Lizman, Zeb ben Nosar, and Chutz Lizman. One is nosar where it's left over the next day, and one is the machshava chusman. They're both talking about the item itself. La puke tuma saguf shipsul mamakriv. The nosar and the pigel are the item itself. The carbon is nosar and pigel, as opposed to tuma where it's the person, the makriv, the person being in. So these has 5 things in common. So therefore, you should say that you're not nosar from pigel, and just like pigel, you're not chayiv on a davar she'ein lo matirin. Here also, you shouldn't be chayiv on a davar she'ein lo matirin by nosar. Ella midatani levi. How do you know that nosar has a halacha like tuma that what you're chayiv even on a davar she'ein lo matirin? The Tani Levi minayin back in the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom page. Minayin she'af b'psul zman akosim medaber. How do we know that when the pasuk says that you shouldn't bring something while you're in a state of tuma, or if the animal's tummy or where you're tummy, you shouldn't bring it? Why? We're talking about even a psul zman, even when there's a problem with a deadline, psul zman, meaning you didn't eat the carbon in time, you didn't eat it, let's say, in the first 2 days when you could eat a shlomim or a bechor or maser, but you waited till the 3rd day. How do we know the pasuk is speaking about the eshap psul zman akosim daber tam lomer v'lo yichalu as kosher b'nei Israel b'shnei akosim daber? You could have said lo yachal lo yachel. The girsa is lo yichalu. You could have said lo yichalu, which is said don't profane it. Why does it say lo yichalalu? To tell me that kosim daber, we're talking about 2 things. We're talking about 2 kinds of profane here, that the animal is profane. Medaber echab psul nosav echab psul tama. So even though the pasuk is really speaking about that the nosar b'nei Yisrael mikorban Hashem mikdishim if they're tomei, the pasuk is speaking about tomei. He says since it says lo yichalu, it's talking about 2 kinds of chilul and 2 kinds of making a carbon profane. Kosim daber shneichel and kosim daber. 1 psul nosar. The echab psul tuma, not only the pashup shad of tuma, but also nosar, which is also a psul. So we're talking about 2 kinds of things over here. It says lo yichalu. Rashi says ksiv rabbi tuma. B'shneichel milo ksiv v'nozru v'lo yichalu. Therefore, we're talking about echab psul nosar. Ashkem be chilul. Ki eskar Hashem chilul. We're talking about nosar v'tabayu koi. Hashem mekdishim the rabbinim minei kol mikdashim. All right, so we'll stop here. We'll pick up here tomorrow, Hashem, from the 2 dots. Have a good day, everybody. Kol tuv.